the main thing that I want to stress is that a lot of people think that biology, the way that your brain is made up, the way that you're made up, your genetics, everything goes straight to influence your mental processing and the way that you are and who you are. And one thing that's really interesting to me is that although that is true, a lot of research is showing that just as much as that is true, it's also true that what you think can also impact the biology of your brain, like simultaneously, a feedback loop. At cognitive behavioral therapy, which I want to talk about today, which is basically the idea of rewiring your brain. Cognitive behavioral therapy is essentially taking advantage of the neuroplasticity of your brain. And neuroplasticity, if you break down the word, neuro means brain. Plasticity is the ability for it to mold, change shape, change structure, hence changing the way that it works. So I wanted to emphasize the fact that biology impacts our thinking as much as our thinking impacts our biology. And with that being said, I think that there are four main categories of this. The first is structure. The second is brain chemistry. The third is function, which are the electrical signals going through your brain. And the fourth is genetics. So the first thing that I wanted to emphasize is the structure of your brain. So as I mentioned, neuroplasticity is the ability of your brain to mold and function, and to mold and function in different ways as time goes on. A lot of people think that stops when you become an adult. That's actually not true. Your brain is constantly adding on layers, changing its form, using different pathways to think about different things, and it's crazy. So that structure is a key aspect in realizing your emotions and your feelings. So your structure, the two main parts of your brain that I wanted to talk about is the hippocampus and the amygdala, because those are the two parts of your brain that are most heavily impacted, or most heavily influenced by mental illness and various negative thought processing. So your hippocampus is the part of your brain. It's the part of your brain that processes your emotion. So, for example, people with depression or anxiety, their hippocampus is significantly smaller than those without. And that's because it shrinks as you're experiencing depression. And I thought that was really interesting because a lot of people don't think mental health is a thing and there's a stigma towards it. And this is a physical, you can see it on an MRI. I'll pop the picture up. This is the brain of someone with a normal brain scan, and then someone with depression, that's a scan of their brain. And you can see that part of the brain is significantly smaller. So if the part of your brain that's processing emotions is smaller, then it leads you to think perhaps those emotions aren't being processed correctly. Second part of the brain that I think is really significant to touch on is the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for the fight or flight response that a lot of people know about. It's like the fear part of your brain. It processes fear. And so people with depression have a larger and more active amygdala, which means that the chemicals in the brain that are associated with the amygdala, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, are more prevalent, and that part is larger. And so those are two physical structural changes in the brain that are being exemplified by those that struggle with, I've been using the example of depression. I feel as though that is a widely known mental illness. And perhaps I know the most about it. So as I mentioned with the brain chemistry, the chemicals in the brain that most people think about, serotonin, that's like the confidence, happy, SSRIs, that's a type of antidepressant, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And a lot of people think that just makes serotonin in your brain. It doesn't. It actually impacts how much serotonin is available at the receptor. I'm getting off topic. Anyways, nerding out. Another chemical is dopamine. It is associated with rewards and pleasure, and just that's the one that can also skyrocket when you do some crazy drugs. That's dopamine. Norepinephrine. So that has a lot to do with decreased pain sensation and feeling elated. You might notice that when you're in that fight or flight response that I mentioned earlier, you have so much norepinephrine, adrenaline, and that some of your pain, like when you're running a race, if you're an athlete, if you're running a race, you sometimes won't notice a certain pain in your body until afterwards, after the adrenaline has worn off. So that's a good example of that. Oxytocin, that is the neurotransmitter for bonding, for love. It's the love hormone is what people call it. And then GABA, that is the idea that our brain and us as humans can be resilient, and the idea that we can kind of bring ourselves down to earth and perhaps be a little bit more grounded and less anxious. So those are chemicals, neurotransmitters in our brains, that different levels of those, you've probably heard the chemical imbalance of people with some mental illnesses. Those are the chemicals they're talking about. Thought that was important to mention. And what I thought was really interesting about studying this is that a lot of medications, a lot of times people take medications because they believe that, okay, so if biology is structuring my thoughts, then I must need to start at the root of the problem. If I have a chemical imbalance, I should fix the chemical imbalance. But that is only half the picture. The other half of the picture, 50-50%, is that your thoughts also impact the biology. And so with that being said, there's simultaneous research that proves that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the rewiring of your thought processes in your brain, can impact just as much as medication can, in some cases, those levels of neurotransmitters in your brain. So if I'm taking a medication to fix the biology to then fix my thoughts, you can also fix your thoughts, which will in turn, like simultaneously, go to fix your brain chemicals. So it's a really cool inverse process. It's kind of like vice versa of one another. And so one of the things that I keep mentioning is cognitive behavioral therapy. And I'm realizing that I'm not really giving you a full explanation. So this is how I think about it. The idea of rewiring your thoughts to then change your biology. So that opposite process of what the norm is. I'm going to give you an example that I think summarizes it really well. If I wake up in the morning and I am used to saying, ugh, I have to go talk to people and go to class. It is going to be so stressful. It's going to suck. I look bad. I don't know how to have any social skills. I don't know how to speak to people. I can't handle this. I can't handle this. I can't handle this. What happens there is that those feelings of perhaps fear and stress, which the chemicals that get released in your brain when you're in a fearful or stressful situation, are cortisol and adrenaline. And so when you tell yourself that something is going to be fearful, your body is very wired, like connected, interconnected. So when even if you aren't actually in that position of fear yet, that anxiety about it, because you have said it, put it into existence, and perhaps believing it in your head, because you have been doing that, your brain is like, oh, well, it's about to be a fear response, so let me go pump out some cortisol, let me go pump out some adrenaline. And so without even probably getting out of your bed, you thought those thoughts. So now your brain you've started the day with more of those neurotransmitters and chemicals being released in your brain. And it becomes a flood. It becomes a flood because those are also the chemicals that are associated with those physical changes of the amygdala and the hippocampus. So it's all connected. And so when that happens, that pathway that thought process is creating this stress response, because the cortisol and the adrenaline, those are all being released. It's flooding your body. And so those are the chemicals that, if you're being chased by a bear, those are the same chemicals that would come out. So it's this paranoia, almost like this non-rational type of feeling and sensation that's actually really, it's scientifically, chemically, completely normal, because it makes sense. If you're putting yourself in a mentally figurative, fearful situation, of course your brain would be triggered. I mean, we would hope that our brain would work that way. Otherwise, the fight or flight response would not work. And sometimes it doesn't work with certain people. So then let me give you the contrary. If you wake up in the morning and you say, it's going to be a great day. I am going to make the best out of every situation. I'm going to work my hardest. And I am going to put my best foot forward and smile at people and make the world a better place. I'm going to shine my light. If that happens, then even if you don't feel it in your heart, it is the cognitive process of making yourself think that will prevent those excess chemicals from being released. And so you've automatically, just by forcing yourself a few thoughts in the morning, eliminated that flood of chemicals that will create a stress response. So you're eliminating the stress response. Not that easy, though. That brings me to my third point. It's the function, the electrical function of your brain. And the reason it's called function is because your brain is a ton of sodium, potassium, ion pumps. That's basically electricity, positive, negative, exchanging electricity. Your brain, you have to go through a process where you subconsciously are telling your brain what chemicals it needs to release. And so when we think that thought, it's processing, and then the brain says, oh, right, that's the thought. So then it sends the specific chemicals needed for that, and it goes through the neural pathway. So that impulse is from one part of the brain to another, and that's what forms that neural pathway. And neural pathway is the best way I could think about it is like the concept of a road. So every time you think of a thought, it's like a road. You're driving down that road. If you think that thought a lot of times, it's like a 3-lane highway. Like that is thick, It is hard to get on. It's hard to get off. It is hardwired in your brain. On the contrary, if we don't think a thought a lot, and if we stop thinking it as much, our brains, hence the term being able to mold and shape neuroplasticity, our brains actually shrink it down to like a narrow road, back road that's just one lane, one way. And then actually, if you stop thinking that thought altogether, the neural pathway associated with that thought will get cut off, clipped off by your body. Your brain will tell it to clip it off because it wants to optimize its efficiency. And so what happens is, if we can at first control our thought consciously, the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy is that eventually, when those depressive thoughts are that 3-lane highway, I'm not good enough, I find no purpose in life, I'm lonely, nobody likes me, I'm annoying. When we force ourselves to first become aware of it, because you can't change what you're not aware of, and then substitute the awareness, we take that awareness and then of what our thought was, and then we substitute that thought with one that we know is rational, even though we might not feel it in our hearts, we know it's rational. So substituting I'm annoying with I'm my own person, and I love myself, and I am my own best friend. And so when you substitute that, then that positive thought will become the highway. And hopefully, the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, my testimony, it works, then those depressive thoughts will become the narrow back road, one way, and then hopefully eventually get clipped off. And so I thought the coolest thing about all of this is the fourth factor, which is the genetics. We know that a big part of mental illness and cognitive functioning, it can be hereditary. So it can be passed down. It's not totally out of your control. Like, you can't help the tree that your apple was picked from. I don't know the right saying, but it's the idea that that's not necessarily true. If you put enough work into changing the way that your thoughts impact your biology, so much so that your biology changes, it's been proven that it doesn't have to get passed down as a trait to your children, to your children's children. And even if physically you're in the same environment, mentally you can break that curse. Mentally you can think differently. Way easier said than done. I mean, like I said, this takes some people years to do, and even then not perfected. So I just thought that was the ability to turn on and off genes in our biological makeup based on our thoughts is so empowering, because we often say we don't have control over who we are or what we innately do or feel or think, but we do. And that's really cool. It kind of gives me like a sense of groundedness and control in terms of my future. and how I want to be and who I want to be and how I want to impact people.